A good man is hard to find. The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. He was sitting on the edge of his chair at the table, bent over the orange sports section of the Journal. "Now look here, Bailey," she said. "See here, read this." And she stood with one hand on her thin hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. "Here, this fellow that calls himself the Misfit is loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida. And you read here what it says he did to these people. Just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that, loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did." Bailey didn't look up from his reading, so she wheeled around then and faced the children's mother, a young woman in slacks, whose face was as broad and innocent as a cabbage, and was tied around with a green headkerchief that had 2 points on the top like rabbit's ears. She was sitting on the sofa, feeding the baby his apricots out of a jar. "The children must have been to Florida before," the old lady said. "You all ought to take them somewhere else for a change, so they would see different parts of the world and be broad. They never have been to East Tennessee." The children's mother didn't seem to hear her, but the 8-year-old boy, John Wesley, a stocky child with glasses, said, "If you don't want to go to Florida, why don't you stay at home?" He and the little girl, June Starr, were reading the funny papers on the floor. "She wouldn't stay at home to be queen for a day," June Starr said, without raising her yellow head. "Yes, and what would you do if this fellow, the Misfit, caught you?" the grandmother asked. "I'd smack his face," John Wesley said. "She wouldn't stay at home for $1,000,000, June Starr said. "Afraid she'd miss something. She has to go everywhere we go." "All right, miss," the grandmother said. "Just remember that the next time you want me to curl your hair." June Starr said her hair was naturally curly. The next morning, the grandmother was the first one in the car, ready to go. She had her big black valise that looked like the head of a hippopotamus in one corner, and underneath it she was hiding a basket with Pitty Sing, the cat, in it. She didn't intend for the cat to be left alone in the house for 3 days, because he would miss her too much, and she was afraid he might brush against one of her gas burners and accidentally asphyxiate himself. Her son, Bailey, didn't like to arrive at a motel with a cat. She sat in the back, in the middle seat, with John Wesley and June Starr on either side of her. Bailey and the children's mother and the baby sat in front, and they left Atlanta at 8:45, with the mileage on the car at 55,890. The grandmother wrote this down because she thought it would be interesting to see how many miles they had been when they got back. It took them 20 minutes to reach the outskirts of the city. The old lady settled herself comfortably, removing her white cotton gloves and putting them up with her purse on the shelf in front of the back window. The children's mother still had on slacks and still had her head tied up in a green kerchief, but the grandmother had on a navy blue straw sailor hat with a bunch of white violets on the brim and a navy blue dress with a white small dot in the print. Her collars and cuffs were white organdy, trimmed with lace, and at her neckline she had pinned a purple spray of cloth violets containing a sachet. In case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. She said she thought it was going to be a good day for driving, neither too hot nor too cold, and she cautioned Bailey that the speed limit was 55 miles an hour, and that the patrolmen hid themselves behind billboards and small clumps of trees and sped out after you before you had a chance to slow down. She pointed out interesting details of the scenery: Stone Mountain, the blue granite that in some places came up to both sides of the highway, the brilliant red clay banks slightly streaked with purple, and the various crops that made rows of green lace work on the ground. The trees were full of silver-white sunlight, and the meanest of them sparkled. The children were reading comic magazines, and their mother had gone back to sleep. "Let's go through Georgia fast so we don't have to look at it much," John Wesley said.
"If I were a little boy," said the grandmother, "I wouldn't talk about my native state that way. Tennessee has the mountains, and Georgia has the hills."
"Tennessee is just a hillbilly dumping ground," John Wesley said, "and Georgia is a lousy state too."
"You said it," June Star said.
"In my time," said the grandmother, folding her thin-veined fingers,
"children were more respectful of their native states and their parents and everything else. People did right then. Oh, look at that cute little pickaninny,"
she said, and pointed to a Negro child standing in the door of a shack.
"Wouldn't that make a picture now?"
she asked, and they all turned and looked at the little Negro out of the back window. He waved.
"He didn't have any breeches on," June Star said. "He probably didn't have any," the grandmother explained. "Little riggers in the country don't have things like we do. If I could paint, I'd paint that picture," she said.
The children exchanged comic books.